Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for what I'm sure we are already, it will be a disruptive conversation and a live performance, just kidding. It's going to be it will be lively, and it will be a candid conversation on narrating humanitarianism, power, media, and the power of humanitarian narratives. I'm Annie Slemrod, Middle East editor at the New Humanitarian, although lately my own journalistic practice focuses more on participatory journalism, which is kind of probably why I'm here, which in a very, very tiny nutshell means reporting with communities rather than on them. It's a topic I'm quite passionate about, so I am honored to be joined today by three brilliant guests who have insight into how stories of people living through humanitarian crises, wars, famines, droughts are told or not, and used or not. With me are Shada Atwai, an artist from Yemen who is now based in Edinburgh. Much of her work focuses on the war in Yemen, including displaced communities and the portrayal of women. Next to her is Jess Crombie, a researcher and scholar at the University of the Arts London. She has 2 decades of work in the aid sector, and now she works with NGOs and UN agencies on ethical storytelling, if I've got that right. And if I've got it wrong, she will tell you. And here next to me is Dr. Alan Janji, who is an advocate and campaigns manager for the UK's Asylum Matters. Just a quick note, we have almost an hour and a half. I will try to save, if there's interest, time for questions at the end. But hopefully, I'm encouraging everyone to talk to each other, so if you can save those questions, that's cool. And we will try to get to them. Alan, I am going to start with you because you are sitting next to me. You have a unique perspective, having gone through the UK asylum system and now sort of working in the aid world. What is your take on how the voices and experiences of refugees and migrants are represented both in the media and in the aid world? We sort of have a big remit on this panel, so you can talk about either.
Thank you so much, Annie. Hi, everyone. The question that you've asked, it touches on so many aspects of the life that I've lived, the career that I've progressed in, and the research that I'm currently in. When it comes to displaced people, refugees, and asylum seekers, I feel that there has been some progress when it comes to their representation. However, I feel that that progress is not enough. So many times we see refugees and asylum seekers being represented in the media, but in most cases, they are not responsible for the strategy or the framing of those narratives. It is difficult and it is heartbreaking to see people's narratives, people's stories being used as a pawn or as an addition, let's say, to a funding application. Most refugees and asylum seekers are not responsible for framing their stories because they are doing it as an agenda for either the media house or the aid organizations that are behind it. We are currently in a system whereby we hear refugee voices so often, but it is more like, I would say, voiceless emissaries, whereby their voice is being said, or their voice is being heard, but it's never their agenda. They are not on the drawing board. They are not there to determine the strategy on how such narratives are going to be used later. Yeah.
Thanks. Shatha, I mean, you also have some experience with this system. Also in the UK, you were forced to flee Yemen because of your art, and now much of your art, as I said, focuses on Yemen in some way. You know, when you moved to the UK, the Yemen war was still going on. What was your experience of seeing how Yemenis and Yemen was portrayed in the media when you moved?
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for everyone to come here and listen to these very important topics. And I can resonate with Alan what he says about how those refugees are pictured into one frame and following other people's strategies. And what becomes clear to me is the narrow image that people are framed with. I mean, people coming from war zones, like within this survival mode, trying to live, and then when we got outside, we framed as victims, as people in need, and I mean, it's true. I mean, the problem is the suffering. The problem is the suffering is the only language that we are allowed to express, and this is really awful. And what disappears from that language is the dignity, the solidarity, and the courage that people have during these hard circumstances, and how they the small details that they do inside these challenges, and this is what framed them. It's not only as a sad story, but also as a heroes, and this is what's we don't see it in media and in the, institutions. Yeah.
I mean, Jess, you were sort of in the aid world for a long time, and now you are, I think, working to help people change a lot of the issues that Shada and Alan just mentioned. How's that going?
Is this? Yes. The work that I have been doing is actually I spent 20 years traveling around the world talking to people who were experiencing something that meant a humanitarian agency was there supporting them. And the people I was talking to told me the things that I needed to hear in order to report back to the humanitarian agency and donors. But what they also said repeatedly was, I would like to be more in control of my narrative in exactly the same way that you two have expressed and we've talked about. And so the reason where I ended up getting into academia, because I went and did a piece of research called The People in the Pictures, where I interviewed 200 people who have featured in Save the Children's fundraising content and asked them why they shared their stories, how they found the process, and what they thought about the final way they were portrayed. And I did that because I needed to have evidence and data that the things that I was hearing were true. And it's not that people weren't convinced they were true, they just needed to see evidence and data that it definitely was true. And so when you ask me how are things going, a lot of the work I do now is to continue to provide evidence and data that change is possible and probable, and that if you shift the narrative away from holding very tightly to the control which we have as a sector, I guess I'm representing the sector here on this panel today, but when you shift power away from it, the fear that donors and people who you're trying to influence to do something or give something, that they will not respond, does not play out. And so I think that is, alongside that, there's also recognition that people who work in the sector, and we're all here today they know there's a problem with narrative, right? Sometimes I speak to particularly journalists, I will say, who don't necessarily recognise. They say they think that maybe the sector doesn't realise there's a problem, and they're just doing it because they don't know, or maybe they're like evil and they don't realise. But everyone knows there's a problem. They just don't know what to do about it. So, which is why I come back to this point around if you can test and learn and try things and evidence things and prove they work, then you can start to make progress. But in answer to your question, how's it going? Slowly is the one word. It's happening, it's going, but slowly.
Okay, slowly is better than not at all. I'll take it. Alan, I mean, you've done some work, I know. I mean, first of all, you are sort of in the sector as well. I mean, when you say that refugees are used through this voices are used in this one frame. When do people come to you as the communications, when do they want the perspectives of refugees and migrants?
They come to organizations like mine, or they come to me as an advocate when they want to use their stories. And the sad bit about that is, it's not always to the advantage of the refugee community. We've got NGOs, we've got charities that use refugee narratives, that use refugee stories to get for fundraising. And in most cases, when organizations come to use these particular refugee stories, and then they ask for refugees to come up, we as refugees or as asylum seekers, we feel obliged to give them these stories. Because in most cases, they would have been quite prominent in helping us navigate the system. So we are put in a position whereby someone who's helped you for the last 6 months is now saying to you, please, can I have a story? I understand that you've been going through problems. Give me a highlight of those problems. And then myself as a refugee or as an asylum seeker, I have to do a self-censorship now to give them the story that they want. I am not in charge of that story because I hate to say this, but I have to serve a master. The person who's been helping me navigate the system, the person who's trying to help me get the legal status. So I provide that story. And these are the stories that end up creating the knowledge that is out there in the media. Because those organizations, they end up putting those stories in newsletters. They end up using those stories with the fundraising foundations. And those are the stories that the general public will end up knowing. Refugees as vulnerable. But refugee lives are more complex than that. We are not just one-level people. And it is this passion that I have for our stories to be told, because we are just like you and me. We are your neighbors. We are your friends. Why are you treating us as if we were subhuman? Those are the questions that I have for journalists, for media outlets, If it was your daughter, your son, whose story is being used so what's the term?
Extractive?
Extracted.
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you feel? So this is where I stand when it comes to media organizations coming to refugees for stories. You have to look at the background. If that organization has been helping this particular person, and when they come to me, because they'll always say, well, you don't have to tell us if you don't want.
Of course. But
you know that you have to. You don't have much choice. So, yeah.
Shada, you're nodding your head. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, actually, what comes to my mind, about refugees and the stories, as the question is, under what condition are they being asked to speak? And are they being heard as an authors of the meaning, or only as testimonies? Or an evidence of what's happening. So this is actually big questions. Yeah.
Sorry, did you want to come in? Okay. When you moved to Yemen, you continued your practice as an artist. I'm just wondering if you also felt pressure to create art on a specific subject, given that you were funded originally. I don't want to mess up your funding, but as an artist at risk, does that put pressure on you to then make a specific kind of art, to focus on specific subjects?
Yeah, it's a really heavy burden, even though outside, people waiting to represent to other people, represent voice, explain the pain and the sorrow, at the same time act like you are a normal person and everything is fine, and start to be predictive. And this is the harsh thing is when your misery starts to be your story, your reality, and your stories become your labor. And this is where actually you are defined with very narrow picture about who you are, where you come from. If that's you, that's it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot as a journalist, we tend to assume that storytelling or telling your own story can be healing. And it can be healing, but it's not actually healing for everyone all the time, especially if you have just gone through or still going through a traumatic experience. These experiences don't end just because you've left a difficult situation. So it's something that I think I don't want to speak for all of journalism, but that I think is something people are starting to reckon with. Jess, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the kind of instrumentalization of stories as products, really, which is what you guys are describing being on the other side of, right? Whereas I've sat on the side where people are saying, I need stories to fulfill this particular, so the stories are the products to fulfill a particular end, and then the stories become dehumanized. It's not, and then the process becomes dehumanizing, right? And again, I don't think this happens necessarily because people are trying to do that, but I think it's a question of recognition of power. And I think a lot of the time what happens is that people are not recognizing that when you are asking someone to share their experience, it is not because they are intrinsically bound to do that, even though they kind of are. It's not because they might want to do that, but it's because, but it's because it has become instrumentalized and therefore becomes extractive. And then, Patrick, you were talking yesterday about this kind of foundational set of stories, which then becomes a narrative, which is really stuck and embedded. And I think that's the end result of this. And so the kind of structures of power which sit within the organisations, be they media or INGO, which are asking people to share their stories, I'm interested as well, as you know, in participatory and co-creation methodologies, but I don't think that's necessarily the only answer. And I also don't think that it's about, I hear a lot of talk around the idea of sharing voice and empowering people by handing themselves, or the voice for the voiceless, all this kind of stuff, which is all well-meaning and nice. But ultimately, it's about the methods of the production of narrative. Who is in control of those methods of production? Is it someone like me from the UK working in a comms department, or is it someone like you guys with experience of it, or is it a partnership? I don't know. But I think it's that recognition of the power that comes with producing stories, which is not always front of mind for people who are doing it, because that's not the KPI they've been set. What they've been asked to do is produce a fundraising leaflet or a film or whatever, right? That kind of recognition of the great amount of power that people have is, I don't think, talked about enough.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and that also speaks to that this is also about process. That yes, you like you said, someone is told to make a fundraising leaflet, and at the end they think, oh crap, I need some testimonies that are going to make this look good or make this look human, which means that no one who was necessarily a beneficiary, or if we're talking about, I would think even further back, was involved from the start of the programming, which is, I would think that this is all meant to feed into each other. Alan, I know you have done some work on sort of I hope I put this right, the role of refugee voices as used as anecdotes rather than expertise, which is what they are. Lived experience is not just an anecdote. How do you see this?
Yeah, the problem with the extractive processes is that there are some refugee voices that are then ignored because they don't fit the frame that's been set. When people want a refugee story, first of all, they shouldn't come to a refugee with an agenda or with a framework that's been set already. Mm-hmm. We need to be using lived experience as a strategic intelligence when we come to these particular issues. We need to be involving refugees from the onset, from the drawing board, from the ideation process, not as an add-on at the very end or when it comes to the storytelling level. Because in most cases, refugees won't know how your story is going to be used. So this idea of involving refugees from the beginning, that's the shift that needs to take place. Refugees are people with agency. We need to have that power in their hands as well. I think that is where the first problem is, because most institutions, they are not willing to give power to refugees or to any displaced persons, to say the least. So the change that we need has to start from the boardroom, not when we are about to disseminate, so that these poverty stories, will make us get a donation. And it's going to be a very difficult conversation that people need to have. At what stage should you include refugee voices? I am clamoring that it needs to be from the start. If you can't have refugees at the start of the conversation, please don't invite them at the end, because you're using them as pawns. And that is not the way to go.
Sorry, can I clap? I don't know if I'm allowed to. No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think it is something that people maybe aren't ready to acknowledge, that it will mean giving up power or sharing power. And that, again, for those of you who are involved in programming, there's a lot of people who, when you're doing programming, they're looking at data, which is important, of course, but certain kinds of data, and are not considering, actually one of my colleagues here, Sophia, once said that there's a certain kind of journalism that considers refugees the experts in their own lives. And people who have lived through these experiences and are still living through them, I think are probably extremely well placed to play into what kind of programming other people need. It does seem a little bit obvious, but I mean, Jess, what seems obvious to me maybe isn't so easy to put into practice. Is that what's the sticking point?
I think the sticking point is really around what we measure as success as a sector. Okay. So yesterday there was some very interesting conversations about donor-centric narratives, which are, so we're being driven by the money, right? And I think that's the key problem. At the board level, there are no measurements put in place around the narrative impact of your organisation. There are only measurements put in place about how much money you bring in, and therefore, and where you and how you spend that money. But if we were asking but actually narratives are our kind of primary public export to really instrumentalize them. But it's true, if you are a person who is not involved in the aid sector, as a person who is being supported in some way, or as a person who's working there, the only way that you engage with it is through narrative. That's it. That's your only touch point. And so therefore the narratives that we put out into the world are incredibly powerful, and not just for the reasons that we measure, but for other reasons that we don't measure. So I think at a board leadership level, that recognition needs to happen. That kind of acknowledgement of responsibility and therefore accountability needs to happen. And then kind of doing the actual work level, I suppose it's this power relinquishing that needs to happen. And I think, again, like, if I'm maybe being a bit generous, but some people are not relinquishing power because they don't want to, obviously, but a lot of people are not relinquishing it because they don't quite know how. So this idea of, right, well, if you're going to ask someone to share their story, they should be involved in the ideation process right from the start, the briefing process before you've even got to ideation. I've been working with UNHCR actually for the last 3 years because that's what they want to do. And we thought it might take us a year to come up with a methodology that would allow us to do this. We're now 3.5 years in. To be fair, there was a pause due to the closure of AID. But it's hard to take a structure which has sat in place for decades and dismantle it. But it is possible. And UNHCR are doing it at the moment, and they're trialing it and testing it, and they're producing work truly in partnership with people who are refugees and displaced people, and they are using that to fundraise with high-value donors, with regular givers, with the kind of the hardest sets to fundraise with, and it's working. So it is possible, but it's difficult to do, and so you have to, at board level, incentivize your teams to do it by saying this is as important as the other things you do. If we say we are here to support people, then we have to support them in all the ways. Or if we say we're here because we believe in refugee rights, but then we're not enacting them in this way, what are we doing? But that conversation doesn't happen as much as I would like it to, I don't think.
Yeah, that's interesting, Jess, because one of the things that I'm trying to champion is using experiential knowledge or lived experience as strategic intelligence within organizations. We need to value that. We need to coin that equally as other expert knowledge, as other marginal gains that can be measurable quantitatively, even though it's qualitative. The moment organizations start considering that as equal to expert knowledge, it will be valued. At the moment, it is seen as a nice add-on. Which is the problem with most of the qualitative analysis that happens, because it can be measured, because there is no scale to see what does a refugee story add to our baseline, Yes, go on.
I'm sorry, Jutta, I really want to... I'll just say one more small thing and then I'll shut up and let you talk, because I'm sure you have things to say. But it can be, actually, because if you produce stories in this way and then you use them for fundraising, and the fundraising brings in money, then you end up with both qual and quant data. And UNHCR have been doing blind A/B testing, where they're splitting their 300,000 donors in a country and sending half of them one and half of them another kind of appeal, and seeing... So you do get the quant data, but it's interesting. It doesn't. There's even in the face of cold hard data, as well as the qual stuff, it's so entrenched, this idea that someone like me has the right or a better knowledge to create those materials, that there's an ideological shift which is much tougher.
I want to add just one thing about the fundraising. It actually helps for short term, actually save water, food, that's good. But in the long term, it's picturing the people in certain frame, in certain picture, all over again, all over years after years. You bring that image about Yemeni, for example, or refugees in a certain way that you cannot see them other than that. Is stripping away their agency, their authorship, and you see them, like, for example, if you compare a crisis that happens in Mexico, for example, or a hurricane in America, you can see the people are holding each other, helping each other in a crisis. You see how people bonding, how they have their own agency to solve the problem. But if you see Yemenis, you see that hopeless faces waiting for a white van to rescue them. So this is actually the contradiction that I see.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Actually, it leads me... It leads me to something I wanted to ask, which is, there is an argument to play devil's advocate in journalism and I think in aid work of, as you all probably know, bearing witness, and that when there are horrors going on in the world, we need to show them as they are, to either raise money or to raise awareness. I'm sure you all have thoughts on that. I see everybody Alan, what's your take on this sort of concept of bearing witness, which I think can probably and has led to the publication of what we sometimes call poverty porn, or what Shada just described as dehumanizing images?
We have to be real. The world needs to know what is happening. So we can't hide those images. I think that it's important to show the atrocities of the journeys that people go through, or the effects of the wars, or of the persecution, the tortures, and all that. I think we need that. However, let's not use that as a lens to define who we are as refugees. I think it's important to determine, what a refugee is without having to show 25 million images of people who are starving, of people who have been blown to pieces. We need to have dignity for people who are fleeing persecutions and all that. What I find as the problem is that the images are being seen as the story. I think they need to be seen as part of the story. Like I said previously, a refugee is a complex individual. They shouldn't be defined by their wounds. They shouldn't be defined by their tears. But they should be seen like you and me. We all have problems. If you get injured and then I focus on defining you through your injury, that is the wrong thing to do. So let's accept that, yes, refugees go through problems, and yes, we need to highlight some of those images for people to be aware of the situations that are making them leave their homes. But they are more complex than that, yeah.
Jess, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I agree. We need the people. Well, I agree. People need to know what's happening in the world. I'm definitely up for that. But I suppose the two things that I always think about with bearing witness is one around the idea of who is bearing witness. So. We've seen plenty of examples of situations around the world where either external journalists can't get into those places, or don't want to go to those places, or there's no, media interest, and so they just don't go, where people are reporting themselves on what's happening there, and that is often seen as being less valid or important or too subjective, like journalism is objective. So I think that idea about who has the right to bear witness needs unpicking before any claims of bearing witness can happen. And then I suppose the other idea that I often think about is that the claim of bearing witness is that by bearing witness you somehow are able to enable something to be made better. And if that were true, then Darfur wouldn't have continued in the way it did. Gaza wouldn't be continuing in the way it does. Just showing things is not enough. It doesn't stop things happening. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it's not an excuse to show and do whatever you want in the name of savior journalism, right? And so I think those are the two things I think about bearing witness. It's not a kind of get out of jail free card for just doing whatever you want in terms of storytelling.
Yeah, and I think, this seems to be the same in the aid industry when you see equally guilty in terms of imagery that is really just, that I think it is used for fundraising, but also is presented as we are showing you what's really happening, but it is only a one-sided image. From what you guys are telling me, I also feel like it risks, in addition to reducing a person to what happened on the worst day of their lives, it also reduces our understanding of actually if aid groups are trying to help, the kind of help that people might need. Which could often be after you move to a country. It could be a psychosocial support. It could be all sorts of things. I know, Shatha, we've talked about after moving to a country. It's not like it's after moving or getting asylum, this isn't necessarily a golden ticket. It's not, do you have any thoughts on how sort of the media, as you said, which has reduced Yemenis to basically people waiting for a white van, does aid groups or the media portray Yemenis once they actually have left or when they're not waiting for aid?
Sorry, again, the question?
I mean, you spoke very eloquently about how the media and aid portrayals of Yemenis is basically of people waiting for a white aid van or of people looking desperate. And I'm wondering how you feel like that impacts people after they leave Yemen or when they are not waiting for aid. You know, does it limit the conversation about what else people need?
Yeah, because I lived in a war zone for 7 years, and I was in survival mode. And when I got outside to the UK, I saw that picture clearly. If you can imagine, even yourself, you sit down yourself and see what's Yemen to you. You would know what's the Yemen to you. The picture that you used to see and hear about Yemen. You don't see people as thinkers or critics or have their own authorship or agency. So the thing is, what I see from organizations, they produce the same image all the time. And what I wanted to say is, I mean, because I am an artist, I work with different people, different like poets, musician. So we collaborate if you want to produce something, if you want to narrate a picture. And this is actually what should be happening. I mean, if you translate it into humanitarian work, humanitarian organizations should work with people, collaborate with the ground people. I mean, to help. I mean, because we cannot do the same thing and expect different results. And as a saying that I also all the time remember, nothing about us without us. Yeah.
The other thing that happens when, I mean, because we see this big trust deficit, right, in terms of, you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, trust levels in the NGO sector are falling, not as fast as they are for governments, but they're still falling. And so, or the media actually, but still falling. And so, but what happens when you actually practice the nothing without, exactly what you've just been talking about, Shata, when you actually practice that, you see increased trust levels, because actually in the people who we're talking to, our audiences, whoever they are, they don't want to talk to us, the NGOs. They actually don't care about our voices, who we are, what we're doing. The reason that they are giving money, supporting, advocating for, marching, whatever they're doing it, or if they're a government, because, well, that's a whole other issue. No. But is often because they care about people who are experiencing that thing. They care about that issue. That's why they've got involved. And so when we front load our voice, our ideological voice, we erode trust. Whereas actually, when we work in partnership with people to share their true, authentic, lived experience of the thing that is happening, and it's how it's complicated, and how they are humans, and therefore necessarily complicated, like we all are, what we see are rising levels of trust. And so, but again, this sort of flies in the face of the data and things that we believe about how storytelling works and happens. But the actual facts are there to prove that we see growing levels of trust and therefore better levels of engagement. So it's a kind of a win-win situation, but it involves this big power shift, right? It involves this big power shift of essentially stepping away from the controls and saying, we're going to facilitate and platform this, but we're not going to hold on to it so tightly.
It's nice to hear. I think that for me anyway, it's heartening to hear that there is data to show that showing people as complex humans and who have complicated, interesting lives still gets that engagement, and still, if your concern is, in this case, fundraising or programming, then I think that is an important message to get through. Even if we're still at the power shift, we seem to have a problem there. I mean, Alan, I know you've actually worked with some, not to name any names, but journalists and maybe aid agencies on trying to do things differently, where you did get in from the start. How did that go?
I'm going to name them.
Okay. I'm not responsible.
I've worked with a gentleman called Jonathan Miller. Some of you might know him as a journalist for Channel 4. He's one of the few brilliant journalists that I always give credit to. Jonathan Miller is the man.
Okay, yeah, I see why you're naming him then. Fair enough.
Why I've named Jonathan Miller is because he resonated with what I was thinking at the time. And he said something that was quite profound. He said, most of my colleagues within journalism don't treat human life as if it's worth it. I'm trying to... He had an interview where I'm not so sure if it was Yemeni or one of the countries within that region, and he had shown so much dignity to his interviewee, and the response that he got, he started, I think, shedding tears. Why I remember that very well is because I had almost the same experience when I was interviewing a lady from Kurdistan, when I was just finishing my research program, who was telling me something that she had gone through, and she started shedding tears. And because of the cultural differences, I couldn't hug her and offer her comfort. I always remember that particular moment because it stood with me for almost 2.5 weeks. I hadn't been trauma-informed, that trauma-informed practice. Mm-hmm. Many journalists go into that particular space not knowing what to do, but knowing the questions to ask. And that has an effect of breaking people down or reopening the wounds that they would have gone through the journeys. If only journalists were trained to the extent of Jonathan Miller. Sorry, I'll always be saying that particular name.
Did he pay you? Are you sponsored by Jonathan
Miller?
Miller?
Actually.
Yeah,
yeah. He owes me, yeah.
I'll send him in the bill.
But is that level of professionalism, but for me, it even goes beyond professionalism. It's just treating a human life as a human life.
Absolutely.
Regardless of whether one is an asylum seeker, a refugee, or a friend. And when we have reached those levels of journalism, I think we will start hearing real life stories from people who have been displaced, from people who are fleeing all sorts of problems in their home countries. And there will stop being this dehumanizing effect. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in journalism, it's the same problem. It is really about relinquishing power and not going into a story assuming that you know what the answers are going to be, assuming that you know what the story is, asking a few questions and reducing someone to, a 200-word quote and their name and their age and where they fled from and maybe their job, and that's it. It is about relinquishing power, both in your own sort of assumptions about what you know and what you don't know, and also in terms of deciding what is who should decide what is newsworthy, whose voices matter. We face a similar problem, and I think at the end of the day, it is really just this power gap. I've been trying to think about alternative ways of doing things, and Shada, I really like that you brought in what we can learn from artists. What do you think that art? I mean, I don't want to have you represent all of art, but what can we learn from art, and how can it change the way we represent people?
Yeah, when I was in Yemen, and I was painting, I painted like family issues and IDPs, internally displaced persons, while I was relocated and displaced, myself. Mm. And the thing is, when you talk about rebirth, you need to put things into certain categories. And when you talk about headlines, you need to something fast. And when you post something, you need to have to grasp emotional thing, like crying child or starved family, to just get donations. But in art, you can have all of that within dignity itself. You can translate everything within the process itself. Like when I draw the IDBs, I draw the uprooted weather of the people who are leaving from home to home and have no elsewhere to live, and they don't know what's happening there within the picture, within the brush, with the story inside. And the complication, I also draw the mother of earth, the culture, the mother of tea, and not only about blood and crisis and devastation, yeah.
Just to add to that, in my last year of my research program, I went out to create, well, as a filmmaker, I wanted to create the journey narratives of people. And what I did instead is what obviously I'm going to be recommending to all of you is I got my subjects, I got my fellow refugees. We sat down and we said, well, I said, this is the documentary film that I want to make. And I want you to highlight, the journey problems that you had. There's one 16-year-old who said, Alan, why do we always need to talk about our problems? The one thing that I've always wanted, you was telling me, you were saying, why do you always talk about our problems? The one thing that I want to tell you is, I miss the scent of my mother's scarf back home in Africa. Just with that one particular sentence, it changed the whole project. We ended up curating a celebration of African talents. We ended up having a Zimbabwean musician, an Egyptian cook, a Kurdish comedian, a Malawian poet, highlighting the goodness and the brilliance within our refugee community, which is totally different from what I'd originally framed. And this shows us that if we involve people's lived experience from the very beginning, they are able to own this, the authorship that you're talking about, and to change this very naive and negative framework of refugees that we always had. Because if I'm to ask you, honestly, what's the picture of a refugee that you have in your mind? I can almost certainly say that it's not someone like me right now that you have. Because the media has offered us this framework of narrative, this framework of what a refugee is. And that's what we are challenging now. That's the purpose of strategic intelligence, where we are shaking the systems, from the grassroots upwards. And we will change the stories that we have when it comes to the lives of refugees and asylum seekers. Thanks.
I just wanted to add something. One of my paintings, actually, mostly of my paintings, describing real stories have been left to. So, for example, you hear in the media a bombing is there and someone died there. But I painted, there was a house in front of our house. It was, they had like a basement. So all women, whenever the air raids intensified, we go and hide there. It's like a shelter. And we all have been like there, telling stories, laughing, while the surroundings are very awful, like while the walls are shaking from the bombs around us. But we didn't feel it. We felt the security between us, and we felt this solidarity. That's these media never tell these stories. Never tell how strong women they are. I mean, that's why I try to paint women all the time, because when there's something happening inside this home, women are who are, they are the shelter for the children, and they renegotiate the scarcity of the life that they have during these challenges. So I resonate everything that Alan says. Yeah.
Thanks. And for those who are wishing they could see Shada's work, we'll share maybe a link with your website at the end, because I'm wishing that I could, and I've seen it a lot. Thanks for sharing that. I think it speaks a lot to this question of narrative change, which we keep coming up against. In case you can't tell from my accent, I'm American, but I live in the UK, and we're here in Europe, where, quite frankly, a discourse about refugees and migrants can often be really disturbing, and as you said, is not is not representative of what people really are. And I think there is real opportunity when you ask people what they want to tell, that you will get a fuller story. I mean, as Shada knows, I did a project on Yemen, which asked people just to tell their what impacted them most about the war in Yemen. They could say whatever they wanted, and they could send paintings, and they could send poems, and they could whatever. And we got nothing that I expected. I mean, some things that I expected, but love stories and stories of a lot of people talking about how they missed going to school, a lot of people talking about the food and the sense that they missed. And for me, this was a much fuller picture. And frankly, I think for people who are wishing to understand, what is really happening in Yemen, also people talked about how horrific the airstrikes were and are. But this is a multifaceted experience, and to live through war and, of course, to escape war is more complex. But I also think that complexity encourages, I would hope, encourages empathy. I mean, does the data bear that out, please?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say so. I was doing a piece of work last October with Christian Aid and the Disasters Emergency Committee in the UK in Lebanon, and it was exactly the same situation. We were working with 10 women to communicate, and it was a FCDO-funded project. They wanted to know what was happening to these people displaced from southern Lebanon into Beirut. But instead of saying, like, here's a set of questions for you to fill out, we just said, we've got a week. We've got the use of a photographer and a videographer. What do you want to talk about your experiences? And exactly like you say, and you guys were saying, the things people shared were ranged from the trauma and awfulness of their homes being destroyed in southern Lebanon, through to the fact that they had a cat this one woman had this cat that she was completely obsessed with. I say this as a person who also is quite obsessed with cats. But
fair enough, first of all.
Cats. I wanted to make the film about this cat and her relationship with the cat, and part of it was about the way the cat had been a comfort for her. Part of it was just a celebration of catness, So, so we made all these like lovely films with these women, and then we shared it with the Christian Aid's donors, and it did really well, and no one was expecting it to do really well, because it wasn't a kind of, here's a sad story, here's what we did about it, can we have some more money, please? It wasn't that format, and it did really well. It was real complicated, humanized short form, but storytelling. And so I think what you get when you open up the narrative potential is something much more interesting, because also, we talk about fatigue, about donor fatigue and narrative fatigue and media fatigue, and it's complicated, right? Sometimes I think it does exist, maybe it doesn't in the way that it's quite framed. But people do get bored of seeing the same story over and over again. That is definitely true, especially when on social media and in other platforms, they're seeing loads of other different stories, which we are not necessarily always providing with them, right? So there's a gap between what they're seeing when they want to look themselves and what we're providing. And what happens when you open up that power base is you get something which is more real, more humanizing, more controlled by someone who actually knows what's going on there, and you get a closer connection to the people you're trying to influence in some way. So, yeah, it takes longer. It takes longer.
I just wanted to say, you talked about social media, and I think that is one avenue that the refugee and asylum-seeking communities are taking advantage of, because the mainstream in quotes, the mainstream platforms usually don't house our concerns, usually don't want to change their framing, usually don't want to give power to the people, or they don't respect the agency. Social media is becoming a platform that most of the marginalized communities are taking advantage of now. And I encourage you to not dish the mainstream platforms, but give more time to refugee-created media content. In most cases, it's going to be on social media. It is a place where you get authentic voices speaking based on their own strategy, on their own desire, not conforming to a particular agenda or propaganda. We have got loads of channels that we might share with you, where refugees have got podcasts or are doing documentary filming, or are just having general conversations. And I think that these are conversations that need to be heard, not the, should I say some of the platforms that are, no,
Yeah.
I shouldn't. No, I shouldn't.
Are you being paid?
I'll only say the positive ones.
No, go for it. Oh, am I
in charge of them?
Yeah. I mean, we all are aware of big media house platforms which always tell negative stories about refugees, and they always frame refugees in a negative connotation. Maybe it's time that we don't focus on those ones and focus on the smaller ones where refugees are always being shown in their within their authentic spaces, really. I didn't say anyone's name.
It's fine. I don't think I told you not. Oh, okay. I mean, you can do what you want. You please use your authentic voice. Thank you for sharing that. And it also makes me think something about journalism, and I think it's also true about aid work, is that we think a lot, okay, this story is published, or this press release is published, or this programmatic plan, I don't know how to say it the right way, is published, this annual report is published, and then it's done. And you don't think about what it's going to look like when it gets back to the person who's in it, whose story is featured in it, and also maybe you don't want it to, because that's not who your audience is. And I think there's a push. I mean, I have a push in my own work, which is considering audiences in a completely different way. That, the audience for a story, a recent project about Lebanon, which is in multiple languages, is the people who were collaborating on the project as well as an English-speaking audience. And I think that's really important.
So something very interesting that I found out a few years ago was that organisations who know that the people in the stories are also going to be the audiences to the stories have brilliant processes in place to make sure all those stories are signed off. So Shelter in the UK, for example, which is a charity dealing with homelessness, and a number of other actually issues, like UK-based issues around homelessness, have amazing processes of consenting, reconsenting, sharing the content and getting people to actually sign it off and agree to it before it goes out. Every time it's reused, doing that again. They have whole teams of people whose only job, they're called story officers, their only job is to make sure that the people in those stories are really cognizant of every single time it gets used and how it gets used, which is markedly different. And I know, I worked for Save the Children as the director of content for 10 years. It's really hard to do that in an international context. I mean, really hard. It's much easier to pick up the phone to someone in the UK who you share a language with, who is, in a less unstable situation, yada, yada, yada. There's tons of logistics. But I think the fact that that is seen as a priority enough to even fund roles to do it is something which is really interesting. And what you get as well, and this is, again, another sort of added benefit of doing this, is that you're then able to say to people, what are you experiencing now? And so you get these kind of, which obviously funders and donors and audiences really want to see, is what happened next. We all like that in stories, right? So you're able to continue that narrative in a really rich way for everyone involved. So yeah, there's a leaf, I think, that can be taken out of that book, albeit with some more international challenges in our...
There's challenges, but I mean, I think with the recent project, we had contributors, as you said, not just originally consent, but involved the whole time. And because we had really long interviews that were then condensed down and translated, that we went back to them and said, is this still representative of what you said? Is this still correct? And I think, this is not traditional in journalism, but it doesn't make what they said any less true. We weren't saying, can you please change everything you said. We're saying, is this right? This is, and in that case was translated, this project just about Lebanon was translated by a Lebanese person who understood the nuances and the different dialects, etc., which also makes a really big difference. And was explained to the people who didn't necessarily speak English what it had been translated as, if that makes sense. So I mean, it does take more time, this kind of work. I think it's worth it in terms of outcome. We definitely have time for questions. We can start now, or we can probably keep talking about this for ages. But if anybody has questions, Patrick, you have your hand up first, and you're in the front. I might have to wait for mics to come around. You'll be loud, and then no, I'm just kidding. He's coming around with the mic. We can also we'll keep going.
Right there. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't give you guys a heads up. I just decided.
Right. I mean, fantastic panel. I really enjoyed the discussion. I was wondering whether this is, a lot of it boils down to basically two things, interest and ethics. So I find that a lot of times when people say they're getting refugee stories, they're not really interested in the stories. What they're trying to get is evidence for something that they already have. So I want to put out a press release to see all I want to hear is your story of woe, not your whole story. So I'm not really interested in you as a person. And I think ethically that's pretty problematic in the way we approach things. And I think for journalists it's the same thing. We go in to extract us a particular story, not necessarily to hear what they have to say, to actually be interested in them. And it goes also to the bearing witness thing. If we actually talk about bearing witness and we bear the whole witness, we talk about the whole story, but all we do is we bear witness on a particular thing that we've gone in to get and something else. So I'm wondering whether you think that there is a way we can expand what's there now and get people to start seeing the totality of things. I know we've discussed this before, and how, like for example, with the example of the cat lady, but can we systematize that so that there's always looking beyond the immediate suffering to seeing the whole human being, the whole person, the whole society, and telling that story rather than reducing it to the story of problems?
That seems like it's a question for everyone.
It is.
Any volunteers? Alan?
I'll
You're
start.
next to me.
I'm going to start with a question, though. Is it okay if you can give him back the mic?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Give you yes.
Yeah. I'm going to start with a question for you.
All right.
Yeah. If a journalist is coming to me, they want just a part of my story, what would be the reason why they want just that part of the story?
Well, because they are trying to sell a newspaper. And the thing is, they're not, a lot of time, and this, I'm saying that's what is problematic, is that they're coming to you with an agenda that they want to sort of kind of strip off what you have. I mean, I'll just give one example, if it's okay, Annie. There was this, I was talking to this researcher who's been doing work in Bosnia. She was talking about this person who's, like, his image was like one of the main ones that came out of the genocide. And that person has, like, for 20 years, just had journalists coming to his door talking about that particular moment, nothing else. They even tell him to go to the fence where he had been taken pictures of 20 years before, strip down, and let's take another picture of you there. So these are people already with an agenda. They're not interested in him as a person.
Brilliant. You've explained it brilliantly. I'll give you a very, very short answer. What I recommend to my refugee communities when someone approaches you like that is to say, no, thank you. That's it. Because they are being extractive.
Right.
If you don't want to hear more about Alan, I won't give you a bit about Alan. Yeah, so I always encourage, no, thank you.
I'm going to give a more complicated answer. No, just say no. Just say no, kids. So the organisations that I work with, it's just sometimes media organisations, but mostly INGOs, is I encourage them to think about their storytelling as an ecosystem and not as instrumentalised for one particular purpose. So if you think about all of the stories that you're putting out on all the different channels, and if you're a big organisation, that's a lot of stories as part of one ecosystem, and you do a little narrative audit and you see, like, where are all the stories we're telling all the time? Where are the stories we're not telling very much of the time? How can we balance this a little bit? That's a really interesting, easy exercise to be able to do. And then you start to see your stories not just as things to be used for a particular purpose, but actually, what are you putting out into the world? What are the implicit narratives? What are the explicit narratives that you're getting people to hear? So that exercise encourages organisations to start thinking about the accountability of their narrative creation over and above the instrumentalisation of their individual stories.
I want to add something. I don't know is that related or not. But if you imagine someone tells something, the same picture about you, even that it was wrong, by the years you will believe that it's you. It's the only truth about you. And this is what we feel as Yemenis. And if you think about it, after the war, how the world will see the Yemeni, are they responsible, or are they are they able to rule their own country? I mean, or waiting for someone else or other countries from outside to rule them? Because when you give them when you just portray one picture about them, they're people in need, people waiting for help. They don't have their own authorship agencies. So this is actually, you destroy the whole Yemenis. I mean, you're not, even though it comes from good intention, but it has very bad negative effect for the long term, yeah.
Thanks. Did someone? Yes, go for it.
Thank you for the great discussion. We're in a world where the veracity of images and videos coming out of humanitarian settings, especially politicized ones such as Gaza, can be questioned because of the increasing use of AI to generate content. And this has a knock-on effect, what you were saying about trust. So as responsible humanitarian storytellers who want to be trusted, what are the frameworks or safeguards we need to have in place around our use of AI, and how can we counter those AI-generated narratives? Thanks.
I'll pass that to Jess, but for those, I think a lot of you are probably aware, I was just thinking about this today when I was making notes for the panel, because as you probably know, there were some aid groups who used AI-generated images and stories of people claiming that this was a more ethical way of doing things, which I found quite disturbing. Jess, maybe I'll pass to you on this hard question.
I think about this a lot.
Yeah.
I'm starting to work on this a lot. I'm just starting a piece of work with the IRC on this, exactly this. So I don't have all the answers, because I don't think anyone does.
No,
if you do, please tell me what they are. So the big lesson that I have been exploring and thinking about and starting to trial is about what is being called a lot of the time, in this kind of zeitgeisty term, showing the process. So rather than just putting out photos and films and whatever in the way that we always have done, it's about being really explicit to audiences about how things have been made, who's been involved in them. And the knock-on benefit of that in terms of building trust and showing veracity. And this is this kind of idea of showing the process is happening a lot in lots of other fields as well, where veracity is being questioned. But the knock-on process is that you are able to therefore have a more complicated conversation with someone about the process of doing the thing that we do, which is really complicated, but we don't often say that. And so it has this kind of double benefit. And just as an aside, I'm seeing some AI projects which are interesting, which are about including people whose pictures can't be taken, or whose stories can't be shared for safeguarding reasons, in the process of creating AI, not photorealistic imagery, but AI creative imagery about their stories. So if you haven't seen a project that called AI Exhibit, the Refugee Account, which was created with people who had escaped Manus Island in Australia, but where Australia keeps its refugees in a really terrible conditions. Have you heard? I'm sure you all know about this. But if you haven't looked at that, look at that. It's a really, really interesting project where they combine people who have experienced. It was actually a legal firm who made the project. They brought people who had escaped from suffering horrible atrocities on Manus Island together with AI technicians, and together they created images illustrating their legal testimony, which they were using in order to bring a legal case against the Australian government and also ask for policy shifts. And because of the creation of images, the story got a lot more media pickup and therefore pressure on the Australian government than if they weren't there. And it's a really interesting project, and it has some issues, but it's very, very interesting in that idea of how you can use AI, but again, working in partnership with people instead of just deciding how to do it on their behalf.
You're close, so you're up.
Okay, thank you. My name is Daniela. I actually work with the IRC, but on a different level. I do advocacy, so work with political decision makers. And I wanted to ask, also when we talk about power shift and who's producing which narrative, what are your experiences then when we look, especially, I work a lot with the German government, and that has very problematic views. I shouldn't have said that probably, but What is your experience then with institutional donors when you're changing the narratives? Could you, because we talked a lot about the public and public donors and the changes in perceptions, could you elaborate a bit on what you experience when you work with governments, institutional donors?
Alan, yeah, I mean, not the German government necessarily,
No.
but you have some experience in this.
In my role, I work with government ministers, MPs, parliamentarians, local government officials as well, within East Midlands. And it's quite refreshing because most of these individuals, because they are people at the end of the day, most of these individuals are prepared to listen and to hear the voices of those with lived experience. We go to Westminster quite often, in a month, maybe 2 or 3 times. And we try by all means to have engagements with ministers or with MPs who usually don't meet with their respective constituents within their local communities. So, for example, on Monday, this coming Monday, we're taking people with lived experience as refugees to Westminster Parliament to meet some of the Lord Reeves, I think, and other lords. Many of the parliamentarians haven't met people with lived experience. So this could be their first time. And we always welcome such opportunities because it means they are not just gobbling what the right-leaning media is saying. This is an opportunity for them to really speak to someone who's going through the effects of policies that they institute. This is very important because parliamentarians, when they hear these voices, they are now able to raise our issues in Parliament, whether through early day motions, parliamentary debates, or written questions, or however they do it, within the Parliament. So I think it's very important for policymakers, for ministers, for parliamentarians to be able to have these conversations. The problem that I have, and I always highlight negative things when they are there because if I don't do it, no one else will. Most of these conversations end up just being conversations. Most of the political parties, they have a framework that they can't go against. Right now, we are heading towards the local elections in May in the UK. There is a far-right agenda that is well-oiled, well-communicated, and we are heading towards a situation whereby the government might be thinking, if reform wins votes because of the immigration issue, let's pander to that. And that becomes a problem because no matter how much, when I meet them on Monday, they get to learn about the negative effects of their policies. They are humans. At the end of the day, they have to protect their jobs. And their jobs are going to be on the line in May. And the people who are going to be voting are people who are getting narratives from the Daily Mail, from the far-right media. So essentially, we're looking at people who are fighting for their jobs. I don't know what to do. What I can do is just to make sure that we have those dialogues. But whether we'll be able to change a parliamentarian's mind when within the Labour Party they have got this new position now, I think is a tall order, unfortunately.
Jess, you've met with on the funders side, I guess. What?
Yeah, which sometimes includes governments.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, with the Foreign Office as well. What I sometimes see is a failure of imagination because the people that I work with are not people involved in narrative. They are people involved in making decisions about where money goes. And so often what they ask for is dry reports about where money goes, but actually if you show them where the money has gone in a more human way, then then you end up having a better conversation with them. I mean, it's not similar to what you're talking about. Now, whether that has any major policy reaches, I don't have evidence for that. But for example, I've worked with the FCDO quite a lot, and I did some work with UNICEF, and what they asked for was an evaluation report, and what UNICEF gave them was an evaluation report including a film that the children who had, a group of children who'd been involved in this particular program had made using this co-creation method that I'd been working on. And the FCDO hadn't asked for it, but UNICEF gave it to them anyway, and it was very popular, and they ended up wanting to have a little exhibition and an online conversation with these kids, and so therefore their engagement with the humans involved in that program was deepened. But that was UNICEF, who has deeper pockets than some organisations, saying like, let's make a film to do this alongside our evaluation report. But I do think that because of that failure of imagination, as organisations who are talking about these issues, it's our job to bring it to life to everyone that we're talking to, and where we can, we should. And evaluation and reporting back is a really good space for doing that, not one that we maybe use as much as we could. It was a bit of a round the houses answer, but hopefully.
Yeah, Noor.
Sorry,
sorry.
I'll give it to you after.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Sorry, so I'm a student now, but I used to work for USAID, so I am very familiar with the loss of funding landscape. Are you seeing any concerning trends or even positive trends about the private donor-based systems, especially when these private donors often have their own agendas, like religious groups? Yeah, if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Jess, does anybody, who wants to talk about funding?
I mean, this is definitely not my area of where I spend a lot of, it's not my, I don't want to say area of expertise, I'm not sure anywhere is, but I mean, on a personal level, the closure of USAID was a big deal. I ran a consultancy with 5 people, and 1 month after it closed, I had to let 3 of those people go. So, it was, and obviously, boo-hoo, poor me, right? And there was lots of other people having a much, much worse time. I think that the funding, I don't think it's a positive picture in terms of funding agendas, I suppose, is what I see. There's more scrutiny, as there should always be, on how money is spent and where it's spent. But I think maybe there is less freedom. And I suppose a lot of the stuff we're talking about requires freedom for experimentation and testing and learning, and therefore gathering all that lovely data that I talked about at the start to be able to prove that change is possible and works. And at the moment, there is less of that than there was. So, and that's not a good thing. What I do see on a more positive note is a lot of really, really dedicated, extremely passionate people who even, I'm sure you're one of them, but even in extremely straitened times are still trying to continue the change agenda that they were working on before, even in the face of this more difficult time. So I don't see, there was some reporting, and there was an article actually that I was quoted in, but which was basically saying like, oh, people are just ripping it all up and going back to the bad old days. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's true. But it's tough out there right now, for sure. Sorry.
Did you want to?
I also work with grassroots organizations, within local communities, and I have to give I have to show my gratitude to private funders, because there are people out there who want to see a change. And especially, through philanthropy and stuff like that, we are getting people who are listening, and they seem, let me highlight and underline, they seem not to have a private agenda. When projects are about to close, you contact philanthropists, they give you the money. They seem not to have a private agenda, because when it comes to reporting, whether it's monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly, they haven't stated any extraordinary reporting measures. It seems as if these are just good people with money and a good heart. So maybe what I want to say is not all private funders have got a negative agenda. There are some out there who really want to help our communities And we need to applaud them for that.
Noor, I think you may have the last question.
Is it working? Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for this conversation today, and I think I will take time to reflect on each one said today from the panelists or the colleagues around. I have a question about what is our line when it came to criminalization, not just dehumanizing people. And I would like to give examples like now in Europe, the right of movement itself criminalized. And we are seeing and documenting every day unfair trials against refugees and migrants in Greece, in Italy, or in other EU countries. And what is the line for journalists are working on the borderline that collecting evidence that could criminalizing the people on the move? What is the line between the freedom of information and the criminalization of the people on the move? And that's one of the things on the borderlines makes refugees and migrants not feel comfortable while journalists are around, because one of your photo could take a person in Greece for maybe 500 years in prison. And in the same time, how we can balancing, and also if the journalism organizations or institutions have a guideline on reporting on such situation, or also the NGOs. And on the question of shifting the power to community-based organization, to journalists from refugees communities, how much we are seeing that happening not from the donors or private donors or international donors or governments, but inside journalism organizations itself, how many persons in how we can see that, and how we can think about shifting that power internally before speaking about externally.
I think this one's for me, and we have a few minutes. And I want to ask you our last question, so I'll give a quick answer to a very interesting and question that deserves a long answer. Every media organization has its own standards or doesn't. Mine, my personal one, I think, is that the definition of consent is a lot more than signing a consent form or just being asked, can I take your picture? Some of my colleagues here have heard me say this before, but I often feel that when I'm speaking to someone, I feel that I'm trying to talk them out of giving me an interview or letting, I don't take photos, but of being in a story. I think it's really important to be clear what you can expect and what you can't expect, and what the dangers are as far as you know them. And how this photo sometimes could be used, perhaps your intention is good originally, but it can then, it could blow up on social media in a completely different way. I think informed consent is, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it does get reduced to signatures and check boxes, and it needs to be a lot more detailed, because you are absolutely right. For me anyway, my principle is very much do no harm. I do not, but I'm able to work that way because of the organization that I work at and the topics that I work on. I think there is, I hope, increasing thought about this, but I think it's a really good point, especially when it comes to criminalization of both refugees and migrants and aid workers. The second part of your question, okay, this is going to be really fast. The second part of your question about how we can see the power shift in journalism, and I think this is probably also true in aid groups. it used to be that you would almost never see local names. They'd be called fixers, but those are actually the journalists doing most of the work. I think you can count the bylines. That is a start. That's changing in some places, but I think it needs to go much further to who's choosing, who's in power in the newsroom, who's making decisions about what the stories are, what stories are important, and whose stories are important. That's a very short answer because I want to ask everybody else a very, very quick question since we have 1 minute and I'm doing the closing session. Okay, so everybody, thank you in advance before I run off. And you can all run off with me, so if I'm late, it's okay because you'll be with me. In order, one short but useful piece of practical advice or one takeaway for everyone here from this conversation.
I've changed my advice.
Okay.
From the one we talked about before. Innovate, test and learn, do something different, even if only in a small way.
Fabulous.
Try to think outside the picture.
And your website? Where can they find your pictures?
Oh.
Look up your name?
You just search my name in Google and you find me.
Great. Sorry I made that longer. Alan.
Yeah, for me, I think the goal isn't just to tell better stories, but to build systems that include people's lived experience at the center and involve them early.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate your time.